Welcome, everyone. I am so glad to see so many people present, and I see some familiar names and faces, and even some organizations. We have a lot of experts in the room as well, so that's always nice to see. It looks like most people are educators or are coming from nonprofits. I wasn't certain how many families or parents we would have, so I do have some resources to share out with families that you're welcome to share with the families that you interact with. But it seems like most of us are coming from the education field. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. One second. Okay, there we go. All right, how does that look? All right, perfect. Let me just move this box out the way. All right, so again, my name is Resha Conroy. I am the executive director and the founder of the Dyslexia Alliance for Black Children, and we were founded in 2020. So we are still a relatively young nonprofit. Although I have a background in education and I'm a speech language pathologist, what brought me into this work was my experience with my son who has dyslexia and navigating the educational system, trying to get him identified and to access intervention proved to be really difficult. Difficult because there is certainly a lack of knowledge about dyslexia in our educational spaces, but also because he's a Black boy who was sitting in a classroom where there were really low expectations for him. And that really excluded him from the questions that would have pushed the educators and the diagnosticians in the building to think about dyslexia as a possibility for his learning difficulties. And what I, discovered through this journey is that there was nothing unique about my story and that I was not alone. There were many families who were experiencing this as well. So our vision is that every child is a learner empowered to reach their potential, right? So reading being one of those foundational things that's necessary, but certainly academic achievement overall. And our mission is right at this intersection of racism and ableism. So we want to eliminate those amplified inequities for Black children experiencing unaddressed dyslexia and related learning disabilities. Okay, so this is just a quick disclaimer. So I know we don't seem to have too many parents here, but this is not meant to diagnose your child or your student. Certainly you should speak to a professional if you're seeking diagnosis for a specific student. So this is mostly for informational purposes. So there's a lot to cover today, and some things I'm going to move through more quickly than others just based upon who I think the audience is today. But we're going to talk about the barriers to diagnosis for students right at this intersection of racism and ableism. And we're going to look at a little bit of the history. I'm not going to spend a lot of time there. And we're also going to look at social identity, which can overlap and make it more difficult to identify some students. And then we're going to talk about the signs and symptoms of dyslexia and some of the secondary consequences, and then how to support students who have dyslexia both in the school environment and then also at home. So I want you to think about who our public schools educate well. And I'm going to focus specifically on our public schools because I'm going to be using some NAEP data that is looking at public school students, but certainly any traditional school environment. So just to sort of set the stage, we know that we are failing many of our students when it comes to literacy, right? So our 2022 NAEP numbers, so our nation's report card shows that only 33% of fourth graders are reading at or above NAEP proficiency. And this has really been, unchanged for the last several decades, right? Even, pre and post pandemic, we have not seen much difference. And then when we look at these numbers by race and ethnicity, we start to see this disproportionate impact, right, of this crisis. So a lot of these numbers are familiar. If you've been in a presentation with me before, you have seen these numbers. We know that our Black and African American students are, have the sort of lowest rate of proficiency. And we can kind of argue back and forth about what NAEP is really measuring and those types of things, but these are the numbers that we're looking at. I'll also add that within specific groups, so, within Asian and Pacific Islanders, within the Latino community, within the Black and African American community, you will have certain ethnic groups that you'll see have higher rates of proficiency. And there are different things that feed into that. I'm not going to go into that too much today, but I want to acknowledge that no group is a monolith. When we look at this by race and socioeconomic status, which I always like to pull out because a lot of times I'll have people say, well, it's all about, the money, it's all about income and access. And it certainly makes a difference, but it doesn't erase what we see by race. So when we look at Black or African American students and using free or reduced lunch sort of as our marker, we see that if you receive free or reduced lunch, that in that group, only 13% are reading at or above that proficiency level, and then it jumps up to 26%. For our white fourth graders, so if you're receiving free reduced lunch, it's 29%, and then it jumps up to 54% if you're not, right? So obviously, if you have a little bit more money, a little more resources, it makes a difference, right? But when we look at this across race, we're not seeing the erasure of race, right? So for a Black student who's receiving free or reduced lunch, we see it's only 13%, and it goes up to 29% for a white student. But that, that's really a very big difference still across the race. And I like to bring this up because I think about our systems in America, and certainly our educational system, as a caste system, right? And so within a caste system, you can see movement, right? With race being like one of those markers for class, you can see movement within the class, but not necessarily across the class, right? So we see movement within the class, but not across the class. And that's what makes it a caste system. It's really difficult to move outside of that sort of caste that's been set for you. Now, we're talking about social identities here, and we'll go into a little bit about what that means, but we looked at race, we looked a little bit at ethnicity. Now we're looking at disability status, right? So we're still looking at our NAEP numbers. Here we go, all our fourth graders at about that 34%. But if it's a fourth grader who has disabilities, then we're looking at about 8 to 9% that are reading at this proficient level. And so this shows us that there are students who have certain social identities that we are not serving well at all, right? We are absolutely failing them. And if we think about overlapping social identities, certainly if you were to look at a fourth grader who has disabilities, and then think about a fourth grader who has disabilities who happens to be Black, who may speak a dialect that is not received in the classroom, that number is going to go down even more. So kind of just to wrap up some of the key ideas there, we know we have a national literacy crisis. We know that Black and African American students are disproportionately impacted by this crisis. We know that socioeconomic status matters, but it does not erase the impact of differences by race and ethnicity, and that our students with disabilities are not being taught to read, right? So think about all of those identities overlapping and what that looks like for students who have multiple identities that have been historically marginalized or who have been historically underserved. So what we see happening in the classrooms today did not begin today. So I always like to insert a little bit of the historical lens, and I'm not going to do a deep dive here just because of the time that we have, but I want to talk a little bit about the history of literacy in America. Going back 400 plus years, certainly to the period of enslavement of Africans and African Americans with anti-literacy laws, right, where it was prohibited for enslaved Africans to be taught to read, and it was punishable by death, by beatings, and even those who helped them to read could also be punished. But when we dive deeper into what was really being prohibited, it wasn't just access to words, right? Because certainly the Bible was given to enslaved Africans, and some enslaved Africans were actually taught to read whole words. So words that were connected to passages that continued to sort of uphold slavery. Some enslaved Africans were also taught to read words that were necessary to conduct the business of the plantation. They were taught these whole words, but they weren't taught the code of the language. So they could only read what had been given to them, right? They couldn't, pick up something novel and sort of go through it and come across new words and be able to decode that. And that really speaks to just this ongoing knowledge that having access to the code of the language matters, right? And then we have, of course, this period between 1865 and 1954, sort of this period before Brown versus the Board of Education, where we had Jim Crow laws that helped to continue to perpetuate inequities and segregation. And I think about segregation, not just of bodies, but also of resources. And the two photos you see here, I always use these photos because you can see here there's a protest, and this is Jim Crow, but this is not the South, this is the North. And so this sort of persistence of these barriers across the United States, not just the Jim Crow South, but also the Jim Crow North. When we had desegregation, so following Brown versus the Board of Education, one of the things that happened that was really significant was obviously students going in, being integrated, but also we had the significant loss of Black teacher employment, right? It's one of the greatest sort of professional losses of within our history. So we saw a 32% reduction in Black teacher employment in Southern districts that moved from fully segregated to fully integrated. And it was really because Black teachers were not wanted in classrooms that were integrated. So Black teachers teaching white students, that was not something that was welcome at that time. And while they could integrate students, they didn't necessarily have to keep the teachers. And so we lost a lot of strength that came out of this Black teaching pedagogy, right? This Black teaching tradition. And if you have attended a school of education, you certainly have come across many of our theorists like Erikson and Piaget and Vygotsky, but we don't learn about or rely or lean on the success of our Black educators, our Black intellectuals, our Black teaching tradition. And these were things that existed in the Black community that really strengthened what was happening in the classroom. There is a scholar, Dr. Ekusa Lasine, who is sort of codifying these traditions, the things that were happening. And some of the things that came out, I'm just going to highlight some of those principles that came out of this Black teaching tradition. So high expectations for students, right? This is something that we don't see enough of today. Cultivating the spirit of the mind, so connecting learning, not just to, okay, well, what are you going to do as your profession, but connecting it to really your soul experience, to your why. Professional expertise, so our Black educators that were in the classroom truly understood their craft, were respected in their communities, were seen as a source of knowledge. And then this sort of intertwined destiny. So as part of the Black teaching tradition, if you were an educator and you were teaching a student, their success meant your success, which meant the success of your community. So the destinies were really intertwined. So it's almost unacceptable to see a child failing, because then you were failing the community. And then a really strong partnership with families. So educators were part of the communities. They knew mom, they knew dad, they knew grandma, and they were able to really share information about what was happening in the classroom and different ways to support students. So a lot of these things were lost. So just sort of highlighting some of those key ideas, we have, the anti-literacy practices and policies, we have desegregation, we have the loss of Black teaching traditions and community partnerships. And I bring all of this up because all of this informs these sort of layers that we see happening around literacy and education, but also more specifically around those students who are being underserved, including our students who have dyslexia, right? We've removed so many of those things that were strengths. So let's talk a little bit about race and dyslexia. And I'm going to just put a little true or false here, and you can kind of drop your answers into the chat. Black children are more likely to be in special education than children of other races. So what do we think? True or false? Okay, I'm seeing a lot of truths in the chat. Okay. So this is true, right? It's true, but I'm going to also say it's not completely true, right? Whenever we get to the intersection of social identities, we have to always look a little bit more deeply, right? There's always more to the story. So Black children are more likely to be in special education than children of other races. However, the classification is, we see differences in the classification. So Black students are more likely to be classified as intellectually disabled or emotionally disturbed. So those are highly exclusionary classifications. And we do see that the rates vary a little bit by location and the demographics of the school. I give you here one example. In New York City, Black children are 2 times more likely to be diagnosed with emotional disturbance than their non-Black peers, right? And I'll show you in a couple of slides why this is really important and why this becomes a barrier to access for dyslexia identification, but also access to appropriate intervention. So I want to direct you to the work of Dr. Wanda Blanchette, who is out of the School of Education at Rutgers. And in her research, she was one of the first people to really sort of do a deep dive into how Black students were being identified in special education. And what she found was that there was a disproportionate representation of students of color in special education programs, right? So that's true. But particularly in categories like intellectual disabilities and emotional disturbances, rather than within that sort of specific learning disability, which is where dyslexia would fall, dyscalculia would fall there, dysgraphia falls there as well. And those sort of mild disability categories, she found offered a certain level of protection for those who had the privilege to be able to access them, right? So if you have a diagnosis of dyslexia, there's often this idea that that you are, and you see some of this in the social media world, but that you're gifted, right? Gifted with dyslexia, right? So this expectation that you should be achieving, that you can learn, and that you also will get access to the intervention, hopefully, that would allow you to be able to access or build those skills in decoding. Whereas if you are put into a category like emotional disturbance or intellectual disability, it ends up being an exclusionary sort of classification. So here I have the IDEA exclusionary policies that are specific to specific learning disabilities. And what you see here is that if you have a learning problem that is primarily the result of visual, hearing, or motor disabilities, right, which makes sense, of intellectual disabilities or emotional disturbance, those two where we know that Black students are more likely to fall, or of environmental, so what environment would impact whether or not you have dyslexia, cultural, so a culture that is not considered to be quote unquote mainstream, or economic disadvantage, you can be excluded from having a specific learning disability, right? So as Dr. Julie Washington says, when you look at this, a student who is poor and Black, you can exclude them from dyslexia based on this language. And so there are some things that are built into the language of the law that also allows us to, unfortunately, sometimes lead into the bias that we have when we're making the decision around who and who does not have dyslexia. So let's see how this shows up in the numbers, because I certainly heard it in the personal narratives from families, but there is some data to back it up. Not a lot, because there's not a lot of time and resources and research that's put into this area, but there are a few. So just sort of in general, when we look at the population, we know that about 5 to 15% of the population has dyslexia. And there's some research that says that it is as high as 20%. Dyslexia occurs on a spectrum of severity. And so that 20% are really people who maybe have not been identified and it's, rather mild, but that's sort of like 5 to 10% are, moderate to severe. So in 2020, Dr. Tim Odegaard and colleagues looked at school-based classification for students related to dyslexia. And what he found was that African-American, Black, and Latino students are less likely to receive a school-based classification of dyslexia than their Caucasian or white students, right? So if you're a family that doesn't have access to outside clinical diagnosis and you're relying on a school-based classification, then a door has closed for you, right? Because if you're Black or Latino, you're less likely to get that diagnosis or that identification. If a school has a lot of struggling readers, then you're also less likely to be identified with dyslexia, right? And Tim Odegaard talks about it as a sea of struggling readers, right? If everyone is struggling, it's harder to sort of tease out who is struggling because they have a disorder, language-based reading disorder like dyslexia. If you attend a school where there's a higher population of Black or Latino students, you are also less likely to be identified with dyslexia. And then here are just the numbers that he found when using the universal sort of screeners for identification. Even when students had similar profiles, meaning that their reading characteristics were similar, Black students were still less likely. So 3% of Black students versus 6% of white students were given this school-based dyslexia classification. So we're not finding our Black students who have dyslexia. In the state of Connecticut, and there's probably less than 10 states that actually track this sort of data, but in the state of Connecticut, where they do, Dr. Jewel Tallis McCombs did a Freedom of Information Act, and what she found was that white students who had a specific learning disability classification were 7 times more likely to have a dyslexia identification than Black students who had this classification, right? In Texas, where they do some nice tracking of the data, in 2021, they found that about 5% of Texas public school students were identified as having dyslexia. So we know that's still a lot less than we expect to find in the general population, but it's been moving up. So Texas is doing better work around identifying students. But when we look at this by race and ethnicity, we find that 46% of those students were Hispanic, 39% of them were white, and only 3.3% of those students were Black. And just for a frame of reference, the number of students who are Black within the Texas public school system is about 12 to 13%. So again, we're under-identifying Black students with dyslexia. Also to note, Black students represented the largest demographic group of students who were consistently underperforming on the state and the national reading assessment. So, it's not because they were doing better that they weren't being found. They are struggling. They are there. They're just not being identified. So one of the issues that we have is that when you have an IEP team, whether or not a child receives that SLD classification really is subjective. So you can have 2 students who have very similar profiles, and one student gets the identification or the SLD classification, and another student is seen as just a struggling reader, right? Or their academic difficulties take sort of a backseat to maybe some behavioral issues that are presenting, and then they're excluded from this diagnosis. So it can be very subjective. Even with my own son, who is severely dyslexic, the IEP team, after a lot of back and forth, they did not give him the SLD classification. It was because of the speech language pathologist that was on the team, and because he does have some language issues, that he received an IEP at all, right? And this is, like I said, a child who is severely dyslexic. And some of that is around expectations that we have for students and also the bias that we bring into classrooms. And so, there's a lot of research around expectations and bias when it comes to Black students. I have just one study here. So when teachers compared white students and students of color, they were less likely to attribute these sort of difficulties that they saw to a disability, right? And so you're not looking, if you're not looking, you're not going to be able to find those students who have them. And then this can be its own course, and not even a training or a workshop, but its own course. But home language and culture also impact the expectations that we have for students, right? So many of our Black students may speak African American English or Black English. And unfortunately, in our culture, it's seen as a low prestige dialect. So there are a lot of assumptions made about families and about students who are speaking African American English, which might exclude them from a diagnosis because of expectations, but also a lack of understanding about African American English means that the teacher is not going to understand the phonology, the morphology, so all of those components of language that you need to be able to understand in order to provide a sort of differential diagnosis, or to understand whether or not it is a difference or a disability. And then culture, right? And culture speaks to the environment the child is in. It can be anything from expectations around whether or not parents are showing up, whether or not parents care, or how they're showing up. And that can also exclude a child from being diagnosed. So that is some of the barriers that are being faced by students who are at this intersection. And I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about reading and literacy before I get specifically into dyslexia. And since we have a lot of educators here, I'm going to move through this part pretty quickly. If you have questions, please put them in the chat and I'll address them as we get to them a little bit later. So in 2020, the National Reading Panel identified these 5 pillars of early literacy: phonemic awareness, which is our awareness of sounds in words; phonics, where we connect those sounds to letters; fluency, which is going to be our rate, our sort of prosody, intonation, and accuracy when we're reading; vocabulary, so all the words that we understand and use. And all of these things lead to reading comprehension, right? And so these are seen as pillars, but comprehension really is the end result. And we want comprehension that happens at a level that allows students to engage critically with the text that they have. Comprehension is really not one skill, it's a lot of skills that are sort of weaved together, right? So we need to be feeding into all of those skills in order to have students who can comprehend what they're reading. What's missing from these pillars, but I think it's certainly implied and understood by the researchers and experts who did this, is that oral language, for those students who are hearing, is really the foundation of reading. Okay, so I want to talk about oral language because that's going to really be weaved into what we talk about when we talk about identification, some of the risk factors, and then even intervention. So reading begins with language, right? So we know that our interaction with the spoken word begins when we are still in utero, where a fetus can hear their mother's voice at about 6 to 7 months. They recognize it when they're born. They even recognize the voice of people who have been around mom a lot. So if there's a sibling, another parent, a grandparent, they may recognize their voice. And then babies, by the time they're about 12 to 15 months, they understand about 20 to 100 words. And we like to say, just sort of generally, you want one word by one, right? That's sort of like the really low bar, but it's one of the markers that you'll often hear your pediatrician use when you bring them in for their well visits. So one word by one. And then toddlers understand about 300 words. They're able to use about 50 to 100 words, and there's some variability there. Usually we see this sort of explosion of language at around 18 months of age. And then you want to see 2-word combinations by 2, right? So we say 2 words by 2. It's a quick and really easy way for practitioners and teachers and pediatricians and parents to remember. So language, is beginning, this building of language is beginning from infancy. I want to talk about the 5 domains of language and connect those back to these sort of early literacy skills. So we have phonology, so that's the sounds in our language, which we can certainly connect back to phonemic awareness and to one part of that phonics equation. We have morphology, which are going to be those smallest units of language that carry meaning. So very often we think about them as our prefixes, our suffixes, our root words. Syntax, so those are the rules that govern, our sentences, how we put sentences together. Semantics, vocabulary, so you see vocabulary here showing up in language and also showing up in early literacy. And then pragmatics, which is our social communication, so how we use language. And although that doesn't explicitly show up here, when you start reading and when you start making inferences and thinking about characters and their feelings, that is going to show up certainly in comprehension. But these things overlap, and it's important to know that they overlap because we can think about how we can start to really build reading even before a child starts to interact with the written word, right? So oral language is made up of sounds. Our brains have to process these sounds. And as our brain begins that process of building those neurological connections, we build phonological awareness. So this is our awareness of the sounds in our language, beginning with sentences. So, how many words are in a sentence? How many syllables are in a word? What's the first sound you hear in a word? Rhyming words, all of that falls under phonological awareness. And it includes phonemic awareness. So that's the sounds within those individual sounds within a word. And we have to have this phonemic awareness in order to be able to pull out those individual sounds to connect them to letters, which is where we get to phonics, right? So you can see how all of these things build. And if some of these things are missing, you're going to start to see those difficulties. And then I have just a fun fact here for you about our babies and when they're babbling. Babies babble with an accent because they actually are hearing the sounds of their home language, especially those vowels, those vocalizations. And so it's just shows you how incredibly fascinating the human brain is, even, in infancy. All right, so I have a word in front of you, and I wonder if anyone is familiar with this word. If you've been in this sort of workshop before, you may have come across a word similar to this, sort of a silly, ridiculous word that we wouldn't actually use, but it is a real word, and it's a word that if you have the skills to do it, you could actually decode it, right? So does anyone here know this word? Can anyone here, decode this word or read this word? I'm not going to ask you to do it. Just want to know if you think you can.
I feel like I could maybe try it.
Oh, okay. So here's someone who's had some good reading instruction, right? Some good phonics instruction. What makes you feel comfortable? I'm not going to ask you to, but what makes you think that you can decode this word or that you can read this word?
Well, I feel like I see different words inside the word. So I think I have the ending, maybe the beginning. So I feel like I could put it together like a couple parts.
Yeah. So you have some really important foundational skills there, right? You have some strategies that you could use to figure out a word that you have never seen before, right? So first of all, I don't know if you know what this word means. I didn't know what the word meant when I first came across it. It actually means to estimate or to regard something as worthless or unimportant. But it's not a word that I have used, so I didn't know the meaning. But I do know the letters, and I do know the sounds that are connected to those letters, right? So that's sort of the first thing that I could try to use to decode this word to figure out what it is. I also, like you were saying, see parts of other words or parts of words that that I'm familiar with in here, right? So I see this suffix tion in here. Um, Vacation, like that's pretty simple for me to sort of figure out. So I have some strategies to break down a multisyllabic word. I can identify syllables. I can say, okay, well, I see some vowels, so I know that each syllable is going to have a vowel. I can start to break this down. But I couldn't do this if I didn't have that sort of foundational knowledge, right? I would skip over this word. I wouldn't know what it meant. It would decrease my comprehension. The other thing that I see here is that I see parts of this word that don't actually feel super familiar to the English language. So I'm thinking as I look at this word that there may be some parts of it that are borrowed from like Latin, right? Or from maybe from Greek. And so that's something else that's going to help me figure out what this word might be, and that there may be some pronunciations in here that are different than the rules of the English language. This is also a long word, right? So if I'm struggling with sort of phonological memory and I, start reading this word, by the time I get to the end of this word, I may not even be able to hold on to the sounds to be able to read this multisyllabic word. Now, I'm using this word because, most of us here are readers and may have had some really good instruction. And so we have all these strategies to decode it. But for our students, if we don't give them these strategies, they are not going to be able to decode words that are unfamiliar to them, even simple words, right? I can't tell you the amount of middle schoolers that I work with that come across a multisyllabic word and they just stop. And it's like, okay, well, what strategies can you use? They don't have any, right? So it's really important that we are giving our students this foundation. So here's a really simple example of this, right? Based on the simple view of reading, which has the equation, word recognition, right? So our ability to recognize and read a word times language comprehension, so adding meaning to it, equals reading comprehension. So we have the word cat, most of us, that's automatic for us. We can read that. We also know what a cat is, right? So we have some sort of meaning connected to it. And when we connect the meaning with the word, then we actually have reading comprehension. All right, so I'm going to move a little bit more quickly so we can get to dyslexia. I want to keep my eye on the time. So we know that the differences are personal, the diagnosis is clinical, and the treatment is educational, and the understanding is scientific. True or false? And I'm going to give you the answer just so that we can get through most of the slides. Our brains are wired for reading. Most of you here probably know that that is false, and that we actually need to build a reading brain, right? So we build that reading brain through this very explicit, systematic instruction that's part of the science of reading. We also call it structured literacy. And you can see the images here of a struggling reader versus a strong reader, where the strong reader has these really nice connections built, the struggling reader does not. And this is what a dyslexic brain is going to look like if you were to do a functional MRI. So the really quick definition of dyslexia is that it is a specific learning disability. And I do like to call it this because this aligns with our federal laws, characterized by difficulty with reading and spelling words, right? So it's difficulty with words, and that difficulty with words begins before you even start reading, right? It begins with oral language very often. We have several definitions of dyslexia that are present. Let's see if I can get to the next slide. Including the IDA definition of dyslexia that was revised in 2025. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. I'm just going to highlight a few things that are important for you to understand. So specific learning disability, with the difficulties being in reading words or spelling them, you're going to see that decreased accuracy and speed, one or both. And then it's going to vary depending on the orthography. So, you know, what the languages, what those spelling patterns are. It exists along a continuum. So you can have mild or severe. And what's really important is that it persists even with good instruction. And this is where it's really important for us to have good instruction in the classroom so that we can figure out who is really struggling even with good instruction, because those are the students that are likely to have dyslexia. So it's genetic, meaning that it runs in the family, neurobiological, we saw that with the brain, and their environmental influences. This is a little bit, still a little bit controversial around the environmental influences, just because there's a lot of room for bias there in understanding it. I think about it in terms of you can put things into the environment to help make it less severe, but you are not going to cause dyslexia based on your environment. Their underlying difficulties are often with the phonological system, and it might also involve morphology, right? So we're talking about language here. The other thing that's really significant and important is that early oral language weaknesses foreshadow these literacy challenges, right? This is something that I saw with my son. And then we have these secondary consequences that happen with reading comprehension due to having reduced reading experiences. And then we also see that the psychological well-being is impacted. So our students who have dyslexia are going to, you know, experience more school anxiety, depression, and of course, it's going to impact life in general. So here specifically highlighted our employment opportunities, but there are certainly other things that will be impacted as well. Dyslexia is part of the DSM-5, and it falls under specific learning disorder. I'm not going to spend too much time here, but here you can see that it requires a comprehensive assessment. You give you're specific in terms of what the difficulty is, and then you can give a severity. So researchers are still learning about dyslexia and what causes it, but we know that it's brain-based, and we know that there is this genetic component involved. The other thing that's really important to mention is that there's a lot of comorbidity when it comes to dyslexia. One of the biggest ones is, of course, language and communication disorders. So if you have a language or communication disorder, you have 50% of those will also have dyslexia. You can see this happening with ADHD, with mental disorders, and for anxiety, it's even higher. It's like 60%. Dyspraxia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia. So when you're thinking about a comprehensive evaluation, you may be testing for dyslexia, but you want to make sure that you also understand whether or not something else is going on. When we look at the simple view of reading, we're going to see that the difficulties with dyslexia, especially if it's purely dyslexia, is going to be with this part of the equation, so word recognition. So I'm going to go through some of the signs and symptoms of dyslexia, and I am going to leave a couple of minutes. I can stay on a few minutes if I need to for questions. When we think about risk factors for dyslexia, the two biggest risk factors that we can see even before a child starts to read is this family history of dyslexia. So if you have a family history of dyslexia, a parent or a sibling, there's a 40 to 60% chance that you will also have dyslexia. Early language difficulties foreshadows difficulties with reading, including dyslexia. And then difficulties with the sounds of language, so phonological awareness, which we may see a little bit later, but these we can see pretty early, and this is enough to tell us to do something, to act, to provide some intervention, to do an evaluation. The signs and symptoms of dyslexia are going to vary depending on the age. So preschool and early elementary, you're going to really see a lot of those difficulties with the sounds of language, so rhyming words, mispronouncing words. Once you get to some reading, you're going to be guessing letters. The other thing that really comes up a lot is this retrieval of words, right? So word retrieval, having difficulty finding a word that you actually know, right? And that shows up again when you're reading. And then difficulty following multi-step directions. So it's really this language overwhelm that's happening that we see. For our elementary school students, a lot of these things will continue to persist, but you're also going to see difficulty with spelling now. There's a lot of repetition required to learn. You're going to start to see those mental health things coming out. So reading avoidance, maybe some anxiety. And sometimes the listening comprehension will be better than reading comprehension, but not always, because these things can, difficulty with language can co-occur. These things persist into adulthood. Spelling continues to be one of those things that is really persistent. And so, even if reading has been remediated, spelling might still be a challenge. So how do we identify dyslexia? So dyslexia has to be identified through a comprehensive evaluation, and you would be looking at all of these sort of skills in your evaluation. So phonological processing, word reading skills, so real words, nonsense words, spelling, rapid automatized naming, which has to do with your ability to retrieve information that you already know. And then, of course, language should always be evaluated. In a school setting, a school psychologist will typically be the individual who is going to identify dyslexia. It's going to be a classification, not a diagnosis, and this aligns with the Individuals with Disabilities Act. It'll fall under specific learning disabilities, but you can use the word dyslexia in the school setting. There's nothing in the federal law that prohibits it. The diagnosis of dyslexia would happen in a clinical setting or in private practice, right? And so they would rely on the DSM-5, and this could be done by a psychologist. It could also be done by a speech language pathologist in many states, not in all states, but in many states. One who has training in this area would also be able to diagnose. So when we think about what we need to do in terms of intervention is not one size fits all. And this is a really important takeaway. So I hear many people say, oh, the child has dyslexia. All that tells me is that the child has difficulties with reading or spelling. And then I need to figure out, well, what does that look like? What reading deficits are present? What's their present level of performance? What other things might be co-occurring? What other things might be maintaining the difficulties? I want to look at their previous intervention, and then I can decide, okay, well, maybe it is Orton Gillingham, maybe it's another program, maybe their language difficulties are so pronounced that I'm going to have to use something that has lower language demands. But basically what we know is that we're going to be using some sort of intensive cognitive intervention that is explicit and systematic with a high intensity and frequency. And here, this is taken from Reading in the Brain, but you can see the brain of a typical reader and then a reader who has dyslexia before intervention and then after intervention. And the big takeaway here is that you actually see that the brain architecture changes after this intervention. So we can actually change what's happening in the brain. I talked about structured literacy being what we want to use, and structured literacy is not just phonics, it is all of these evidence-based elements that are delivered in a way that is systematic and cumulative, explicit, and diagnostic, because as we teach, we are also diagnosing and prescribing what to do moving forward. So how do we support students with dyslexia? And I'm going to move very quickly now because we're running out of time. The big takeaway here is that we can teach students to read, right? 95% can be taught using this evidence-based reading instruction and this is based on first grade readers. And when I say reading here, I mean this ability to decode words. And then we do have some students who have more severe oral language and working memory difficulties, where you're going to want to bring in your speech language pathologists and other professionals to support them, but they can still be taught to read. So if you're a classroom teacher, some of the things that you can do, there's really no way around it, right? You have to provide the structured literacy. So if you don't have the training, that's something that you need to get and start there, because if a child can read, you really cannot build a supportive environment. When you are delivering content in the classroom, I always caution educators to test for content knowledge, not reading, right? So unless you're actually evaluating reading skills. And what I mean here is that for a student who is reading a test, every test is a reading test, right? So you're testing reading, you're not testing content, because they are not able to read the words. And so you can't tell whether or not it's a reading difficulty or if they haven't acquired the content. So figure out other ways to test them, other ways for them to demonstrate knowledge. Reduce the cognitive overload, provide multiple ways to access content. So it could be audiobooks, it could be videos, create a safe learning environment. So in this way, you want to make sure that you understand what sort of might create a barrier or a trigger for a student who has dyslexia. It might mean not calling on them to read aloud. It might mean ensuring that they have the appropriate self-advocacy skills. You want to honor their culture, their identity, and their linguistic background. And this means that you may have to do some learning about their linguistic background. You want to support their executive function skills. And this might mean explicitly teaching executive function skills, which is something that we don't often do. And then you want to strengthen this sort of home to school connection. Okay. I am going to pause here because we don't have a lot of parents here, and I'm going to open the floor to questions. And I will share out resources so that you have access to this.
Thank you. We have been getting some questions in the chat. So one of the first ones that we've been getting a few times is, will there be access to the slides that you shared?
I don't typically do that, but I will provide access to a handout version of the slides just so that everyone has it. Since we did not get through everything, and since there's some parent resources that I want to be able to share as well.
Great. Next question. To what extent do you think assessment design is leading towards over-identification of speakers of non-standard English as struggling readers?
Well, I think if you don't have a good background in understanding how to perform an assessment, then you're going to either under or over identify, right? So if you have someone who has a different linguistic background, you need to understand, whether or not can they read in their home language, depending on their age level. The other thing that becomes really important is not to just rely on standardized assessments, but to involve things like dynamic assessment as part of your protocol that allows you to test, to teach, and then to retest. And so that will allow you to see whether or not there is a difference or a disorder. But if you have a good understanding of what those deficits are that are going to be present, you should be able to incorporate that into how you approach the evaluation. And that really is going to depend on building up your skills as a clinician or as a diagnostician, and then leaning into your professional sort of pool of people when you have questions.
Thank you so much. That does bring us to time for today's session. I am seeing some lovely praise in the chat saying this has been excellent. It's wonderful, informative. We really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for sharing all this great information. If there are any other questions, feel free to reach out to me, reach out to this. If there's any other questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat. But for now, thank you all so much.
Thank you.